In the winter of 1388, inside the royal apartments of the Louvre Palace in Paris, King Charles VI of France was not alone. That fact by itself was unremarkable. Medieval kings were almost never alone. But what made this moment unusual was how many people were present, and why. As the king prepared to sleep, a small procession entered the chamber. Valets drew back the heavy bed curtains. Courtiers stood silently against the walls. A royal physician waited nearby. A confessor murmured prayers under his breath. At the foot of the bed, officials recorded the hour. Charles VI did not remove his crown. He could not. The crown was not simply an object, it was a condition. Even in sleep, the king remained king. Every movement of his body was observed. Every cough might be noted. Every nightmare might become a matter of state. If the king cried out, servants would rush forward, not out of affection, but out of duty. Because in the medieval world, royalty did not merely rule. Royalty was inhabited. To be born royal was not to gain privilege alone. It was to enter a life governed by ritual, constraint, exposure, and a peculiar form of captivity, one that modern observers often misunderstand. Medieval kings and queens lived surrounded by wealth, ceremony, and power, but they also lived without privacy, without autonomy, and often without the ability to perform even the most basic human actions unobserved. The crown did not rest lightly. From the moment a royal child was born, the body itself ceased to belong entirely to the individual. It became a public object, watched, regulated, protected, feared. In medieval Europe, the king's body was not merely flesh, it was political infrastructure. This idea, famously articulated centuries later by legal theorists as the king's two bodies, was already deeply embedded in medieval practice. The physical body might weaken, age, or bleed, but the royal body, the symbolic body, was eternal, continuous, and inseparable from the state. This belief produced habits that now appear deeply strange. Kings were dressed by committees. Queens gave birth in public chambers. Royal meals were eaten beneath scrutiny so intense that poisoning was feared more than war. Even sleep was staged, regulated, and witnessed. Royalty lived not as individuals, but as institutions with pulse. And this was not limited to kings. Queens, princes, princesses, and even royal infants were subject to this logic. The royal nursery was not a place of intimacy, but of surveillance. Wet nurses were vetted like diplomats, physicians argued over humors, astrologers calculated futures, priests guarded souls before bodies had even learned to walk. The medieval court was not a home. It was a machine. To modern eyes, medieval royalty often appears enviable, a life of feasts, castles, servants, and privilege. But this image obscures the deeper reality. Royal life was profoundly unnatural. It disrupted basic human rhythms, it constrained emotional expression, it turned daily existence into performance, and it exposed individuals to constant risk, not only from assassins and rivals, but from their own bodies, which were expected to embody perfection in a world that understood illness poorly and hygiene imperfectly. Even the most intimate moments were never private. When a medieval queen gave birth, she did so surrounded by witnesses. In England, France, and much of Western Europe, childbirth was a political event. Courtiers needed proof that the child was legitimate. Doors remained open. Officials stood nearby. Sometimes the bed itself was positioned to allow observation. This was not cruelty. It was precaution. Dynastic survival depended on certainty. A swapped infant could trigger civil war. A rumor could fracture a kingdom. And so the queen's body became a site of national anxiety. Royal children, once born, were rarely raised by their parents. Instead, they were handed over to carefully selected households, often far from court, to reduce political risk. Affection was considered dangerous. Emotional attachment was a vulnerability. A prince raised too lovingly might become weak. A princess raised too freely might become disobedient. Royal childhood was austere, monitored, and often lonely. Education began early and was relentless. Princes learned Latin, theology, warfare, court etiquette, and governance. They were taught not merely how to rule, but how to appear to rule, how to sit, stand, gesture, and speak. Silence itself was a skill. A prince who spoke too quickly appeared foolish. One who spoke too little appeared weak. Every posture communicated legitimacy or its absence. Queens, meanwhile, were trained in a different form of endurance. They were expected to embody fertility, piety, restraint, and grace, all while navigating courts filled with rivals, in-laws, spies, and enemies. A queen's failure to produce an heir could ruin her. A queen's success could still end in death from childbirth. Royal women lived under extraordinary physical pressure. Their diets were regulated, their movements were restricted, their reputations were constantly under threat, and their value in dynastic terms was often reduced to what their bodies could produce. Yet even kings were not free. A medieval king could not simply leave court. Travel required weeks of preparation and hundreds of attendants. A king could not eat what he wished. Meals followed ritual sequences overseen by officials whose titles, cupbearer, carver, steward, masked their real purpose, preventing assassination. Food was tasted before consumption, wine was inspected, bread was broken ceremonially. Poison was the medieval obsession. It was feared more than the sword because it attacked invisibly from within. And since royal bodies symbolized the kingdom itself, internal corruption carried cosmic implications. This fear shaped daily life. Kings ate slowly, publicly, under watch. They slept lightly. Many suffered from insomnia, paranoia, and anxiety. Medieval chronicles are filled with references to rulers plagued by visions, omens, and dreams, interpreted as divine warnings. The mind, like the body, was a battlefield. The weirdness of royal life did not come from extravagance alone. It came from contradiction. Royalty was elevated, but trapped, revered, but watched, powerful, but constrained by ritual so dense it bordered on suffocation. A king could command armies, but not solitude. A queen could command deference, but not privacy. And beneath the silks, jewels, and ceremony, medieval royalty lived with a constant awareness of fragility, physical, political, spiritual. Their lives were not lived above ordinary humanity. They were lived under extraordinary pressure. And that pressure shaped everything: how they bathed, how they prayed, how they married, how they loved, how they feared death. Because death, for medieval royalty, was never merely personal. It was catastrophic. The death of a king could collapse alliances, trigger rebellions, invalidate treaties, and invite invasion. And so royal health became a matter of state, monitored obsessively by physicians who relied on humoral theory, bloodletting, astrology, and prayer. When a king fell ill, the kingdom held its breath. And when madness struck, as it did with Charles VI, who would later wander the halls believing himself made of glass, the consequences were devastating. Royal weirdness, then, was not eccentricity. It was the cost of being the living vessel of power in a world that did not separate the human from the symbolic. And that cost began at birth. On a summer morning in 1316, inside the royal palace at Vincennes, the birth of a child was awaited with an intensity that bordered on terror. King Louis VI of France had died months earlier. His widow, Clemence of Hungary, was pregnant. The future of the Capetian dynasty, and with it the stability of the French kingdom, rested entirely on what emerged from her body. When labor began, the queen was not escorted into a private chamber. She was placed at the center of a public space. Curtains were drawn back, not closed. High-ranking nobles, clergy, and court officials gathered nearby. Doors remained open. Witnesses were required not out of curiosity, but necessity. The kingdom needed proof. When the child was born, a boy, he was immediately shown to those present. The infant was examined, identified, and recorded. He would be named John the Third. He would live 5 days. His brief life triggered one of the most consequential succession crises in medieval France, eventually leading to the exclusion of women from the throne and shaping French law for centuries. This was the logic of royal birth. It was never simply biological. It was political, legal, and existential. Medieval royalty entered the world under scrutiny that few modern figures could endure. Birth was not a private moment of family joy. It was a state event governed by fear of fraud, anxiety over legitimacy, and obsession with continuity. Rumors of swapped infants were not uncommon. So were accusations of adultery, illegitimacy, and divine punishment. In a world without DNA testing, certainty required witnesses, and witnesses required exposure. For royal women, this meant that the most vulnerable moment of their lives unfolded under observation. Chroniclers describe queens laboring for days while nobles waited anxiously. Physicians argued, priests prayed, midwives worked under pressure not only to deliver a child, but to deliver certainty. Failure carried consequences. If a queen produced only daughters, her position weakened. If she produced no children, she could be repudiated, confined, or replaced. If she died in childbirth, a common occurrence, she became another entry in a lineage of sacrificed bodies. Royal fertility was never private property. Once born, the royal child was rarely raised by its parents. This was not neglect. It was strategy. In medieval courts, proximity to the monarch was dangerous. Intrigue thrived near power, and so royal infants were often sent away to castles, monasteries, or noble households where they could be raised under controlled conditions. The English kings routinely sent their heirs to be fostered in noble families. French princes might grow up far from Paris. Holy Roman emperors often placed children with ecclesiastical tutors. Parental affection was considered a liability. A child too attached to mother or father might resist political marriages later. A parent too attached to a child might be vulnerable to manipulation. Royal childhood was designed to minimize emotional dependency. Instead, it emphasized discipline, obedience, and role formation. From an early age, royal children were treated less like children and more like incomplete offices. They were introduced to ceremony before they could read. They learned to bow before they learned to write. They were trained to sit motionless during long religious services, to eat without haste, and to speak only when addressed. Silence was enforced. Disobedience was not merely childish misbehavior, it was a threat to order. The education of princes was relentless and often harsh. Tutors employed corporal punishment without hesitation. Latin grammar, scripture, chronicles, and classical texts were drilled daily. Physical training emphasized riding, hunting, and weapons use. Illness was feared. A sickly prince invited uncertainty. Weakness suggested divine displeasure. Many royal children died young, from infections, fevers, or unknown ailments, and their deaths were interpreted as omens. Those who survived learned early that survival itself was achievement. Princesses faced a different fate. Their education focused on piety, etiquette, languages, and household management. They were taught to be agreeable, resilient, and obedient, qualities necessary for a life that would almost certainly take them far from home. A princess rarely married for love. She was exchanged. At adolescence, often as young as 12 or 13, she would be married to a foreign ruler or noble, sealing alliances she did not choose. She might never see her family again. Letters might take months to arrive, if they arrived at all. For many royal women, marriage marked the end of familiarity and the beginning of surveillance under a new court. Her body would again become a public matter. Her fertility would again be monitored. Her failures would again be punished. Even royal boys did not escape bodily scrutiny. Their health was assessed constantly. Physicians inspected urine, pulse, complexion. Bloodletting was prescribed to balance humors. Astrological charts were consulted to determine auspicious moments for education, travel, even haircuts. A prince's body was a predictive instrument. Signs of vigor were celebrated. Signs of weakness were hidden or explained away. This obsession with bodily control produced behaviors that now appeared deeply strange. Bathing, for example, was a fraught activity. While medieval people did bathe more than popular myth suggests, royal bathing was ceremonial and regulated. Water temperature, herbs, and timing were supervised. Excess bathing was thought to weaken the body. Clothing was similarly symbolic. Fabrics communicated rank. Colors carried meaning. Even the way a garment fastened could signal legitimacy. A misplaced sleeve or informal posture could undermine authority. Royal children learned this early. They learned that their bodies were messages, that every gesture was read, that every flaw could become rumor. This environment produced adults who were often emotionally guarded, socially awkward, or intensely anxious. Medieval chronicles hint at this frequently. Kings described as withdrawn, irritable, obsessive, or melancholic. Queens portrayed as rigid, distant, or fiercely controlling. These were not personality quirks. They were adaptations. To live royal was to live exposed, and exposure reshaped the self. By the time a prince ascended the throne, he had already lived decades without privacy. By the time a queen was crowned, she had already survived years of scrutiny, judgment, and bodily risk. The weirdness of medieval royalty was not excess. It was deformation. Lives bent under pressure until they functioned, but never freely. And once crowned, the deformation intensified, because childhood had been preparation. The true strangeness of royal life began not at birth, but at coronation. On a cold December morning in 1066, inside Westminster Abbey, William of Normandy stood surrounded by noise he could not understand. The Norman Duke had just defeated Harold Godwinson at Hastings. He was about to be crowned King of England. The ritual was meant to be solemn, sacred, and orderly. Instead, it nearly ended in disaster. When the Archbishop asked the assembled crowd whether they accepted William as their king, the English shouted assent in their own language. The Norman guards, stationed outside and unable to understand the cries, believed a riot had begun. They set fire to nearby buildings to disperse the crowd. Smoke drifted into the abbey as William was crowned. This was not merely a misunderstanding, it was an omen. From the moment of coronation, the medieval ruler ceased to exist as a private person. He became something else entirely, a public symbol wrapped in rituals so dense that even language itself could fracture under its weight. Coronation was not a celebration, it was a transformation. Medieval coronation rites were long, exhausting, and deeply invasive. They involved anointing the body with holy oil, clothing the ruler in sacred garments, swearing binding oaths, and receiving regalia believed to carry divine authority. Oil was applied to the head, chest, shoulders, and sometimes hands. This act mattered profoundly. Anointing did not merely bless the king, it altered his status. Like a priest at ordination, the king was believed to undergo an ontological change, his body marked by God for rule. From that moment, harming the king was not simply treason, it was sacrilege. This belief intensified the weirdness of royal life, because if the king's body was sacred, it could not be treated casually. Touch became regulated, proximity became political. Even illness became dangerous, not just biologically, but symbolically. A coughing king was unsettling. A bleeding king was alarming. A mad king was catastrophic. After coronation, ritual consumed daily life. The king's day followed a strict sequence. Rising, dressing, prayer, meals, audiences, all occurred under observation. Servants performed precise roles whose origins lay centuries in the past. The groom of the stool attended the king during defecation, not as humiliation, but as trust. This official managed access to the most vulnerable moment of the king's day, and often became one of the most influential figures at court. Privacy was replaced by proximity. Even sleep was ceremonial. The royal bed was often placed in a public or semi-public chamber. Courtiers attended the coucher, the formal act of putting the king to bed, and the lever, the formal act of rising. These rituals demonstrated continuity. If the king rose as expected, the kingdom breathed easier. Queens underwent similar transformations. Their coronations emphasized fertility, obedience, and intercession. Queens were crowned not merely as consorts, but as stabilizers, mediators between king and subjects, heaven and earth. Yet their authority remained conditional. A crowned queen could command deference, but not autonomy. Her power flowed through marriage, motherhood, and moral influence rather than direct command. And her body, again, was never her own. Marriage itself was ritualized to a degree that erased intimacy. Royal weddings were public spectacles. Bedding ceremonies followed, during which witnesses escorted the couple to bed to ensure consummation. Sometimes witnesses remained until the act was believed to have occurred. This was not voyeurism, it was law. Without proof of consummation, a marriage could be challenged. Without legitimate heirs, a dynasty could fail. So even sex was regulated. Love, if it existed, was irrelevant. Once enthroned, the monarch's movements were constrained. A medieval king did not reside in a single capital. He traveled constantly, moving his court from castle to castle. This itinerant lifestyle was not preference, it was necessity. Castles could not support large courts indefinitely. Local resources would be exhausted, and visibility mattered. A king unseen was a king questioned, so the king moved, slowly, ceremonially, with hundreds of attendants. Travel was exhausting and dangerous. Roads were poor, weather unpredictable, disease constant. Yet the king could not travel lightly. Every journey required advanced planning, provisioning, and security. Stopping at a noble's estate could be interpreted as favor or threat. Everything was symbolic. Even eating remained a performance. Royal meals followed strict hierarchy. Dishes were announced, carvers performed ritual cuts, cupbearers tasted wine, spills could provoke suspicion, a sudden illness after a meal could ignite panic. Poison was feared constantly, not without reason. Medieval chronicles record multiple attempts, successful and otherwise, to poison royalty. Because assassination by blade was difficult, Poison could be administered quietly, invisibly, and deniably. This fear produced obsessive precaution. Food preparation was controlled, kitchens were guarded, utensils were monitored, even servants were scrutinized. Royal paranoia was not irrational, it was adaptive. Mental strain followed. Many medieval kings displayed signs of anxiety, obsession, or depression. Some became intensely religious. Others withdrew. A few unraveled entirely. Charles VI of France believed himself made of glass. Henry VI of England entered catatonic states. Joanna of Castile was confined for alleged madness. Mental illness, poorly understood, was framed as divine punishment, demonic influence, or bodily imbalance. Treatment involved prayer, bloodletting, isolation, rarely compassion. A king who lost control of his mind lost control of his kingdom. Regencies followed. Factions formed. Violence erupted because monarchy was not a job that could be paused. There was no sick leave. There was no retirement. A king ruled until death, or removal. And removal was dangerous. Deposition threatened the entire logic of sacred kingship. If a king could be removed, then he was not chosen by God. So removal was justified with elaborate narratives: tyranny, madness, heresy. Royal weirdness intensified during crisis. During famine, plague, or war, the king became a lightning rod. Subjects expected protection, justice, and intercession. Failure was interpreted cosmically. The Black Death devastated Europe in the mid-14th century. Millions died. Kings prayed publicly, processions multiplied, yet death continued. Some rulers were blamed, others were pitied, but none were untouched. Royal bodies were not immune to plague. When kings fell ill, panic spread faster than disease. Courts fled, administration collapsed, power fragmented. This fragility haunted royalty constantly. The crown conferred authority, but also unbearable pressure. To be crowned was to be erased. The person vanished beneath the office, and the office demanded everything. Even death did not restore privacy. In the autumn of 1270, as King Louis IX of France lay dying outside the walls of Tunis, his suffering unfolded under watchful eyes. He was emaciated by dysentery, his skin burned with fever. His strength was gone, yet even in agony, Louis was not permitted solitude. Clergy recited prayers at his bedside. Knights waited for instructions. Courtiers observed his final gestures. Chroniclers would later record his words carefully, preserving them as moral exemplars. Louis did not die as a man. He died as a symbol. For medieval royalty, death was not the end of exposure. It was its final intensification. The death of a king or queen was among the most dangerous moments in the life of a kingdom. Power did not pass automatically. It had to be managed, staged, and explained, and so royal death became a carefully orchestrated event, part ritual, part insurance against chaos. The king's final hours were treated as sacred theater. Confession was mandatory. Last rites were performed publicly. The king was expected to die well, calmly, piously, without panic. A good death affirmed divine favor. A bad death provoked fear. Chroniclers paid close attention. A king who raged, screamed, or despaired at death invited suspicion. A king who accepted death peacefully was praised as righteous, even saintly. These narratives mattered. They shaped memory, legitimacy, and political stability. Once death occurred, the body itself became a problem. Royal corpses decomposed like all others, but decay was politically unacceptable. The king's body represented continuity. Its corruption threatened the illusion of permanence. This tension produced some of the strangest funerary practices in medieval Europe. In many cases, royal bodies were dismembered. The practice known as mos teutonicus involved boiling the corpse to separate flesh from bone. The bones could then be transported long distances without decay. Hearts and entrails were often buried separately in symbolic locations. Richard the Lionheart's heart was buried in Rouen. His body lay at Fontevraud. His entrails remained elsewhere. This was not macabre indulgence. It was logistics and symbolism combined. By distributing the royal body across key territories, loyalty was reinforced. Memory was anchored in multiple places. The king, quite literally, ruled in death. Queens were treated similarly. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the medieval world, was buried at Fontevraud Abbey, her effigy depicting her reading, an unusual image emphasizing intellect rather than submission. Funeral processions were elaborate and slow. Black-draped horses, candles, chanting clergy, heralds displaying arms. The body was often displayed publicly, sometimes for days. Subjects needed to see that the king was truly dead. Doubt was dangerous. Impostors could emerge. Pretenders could rally support. Rumors could destabilize succession. The corpse was proof. Yet even as the body lay dead, the monarchy did not pause. The king is dead. Long live the king. This phrase captured the medieval understanding of kingship. The physical body died. The royal body persisted. Succession rituals often began immediately. In France, the heir became king at the moment of death, even before coronation. In England, councils moved quickly to proclaim continuity. Delay invited rebellion. So mourning was regulated. Excessive grief could be interpreted as political weakness. The court moved forward with ceremony even as bodies cooled. Queens faced particular danger during this period. A widowed queen could be revered or discarded. Her political value depended on age, fertility, and alliances. Some queens served as regents, ruling for underage sons. Others were confined to convents, stripped of influence. Few had choice. Royal death also triggered accounting. Treasuries were inventoried, offices reassigned, favors reassessed, loyalty tested. Those who had been close to the deceased king often fell from favor. Others rose quickly. The dead king's servants were vulnerable. Power shifted brutally. The strangeness of royal death lay not in ritual alone, but in emotional suppression. Royal children were expected to grieve with dignity. Tears were permitted, hysteria was not. A prince who wept uncontrollably might be deemed unfit. A queen who mourned too long might be accused of undermining stability. Private sorrow was subordinated to public order. Even burial sites were political. Kings were buried in dynastic monasteries, Westminster Abbey, Saint-Denis, Fontevraud, places that reinforced continuity. Effigies were carved not as corpses, but as idealized rulers, eyes open, faces serene. Death was sanitized. The effigy mattered more than the body, because memory mattered more than truth. This extended into sainthood. Some kings, like Louis the Mine, were canonized. Their lives were retroactively purified. Political failures were reframed as pious trials. Their weirdness became sanctity. Others were vilified. Richard II of England, deposed and likely murdered, was remembered as weak and erratic. His death justified rebellion. Royal death narratives were weapons, and yet, beneath all this ritual lay a simple reality. Medieval royalty lived with constant awareness that death would not free them. Their bodies would be inspected. Their deaths would be judged. Their memories would be manipulated. Even in the grave, they remained tools. This awareness shaped how rulers lived. They commissioned chronicles to control narratives. They endowed monasteries to secure prayers. They staged acts of piety to influence posterity. Royal life was lived with one eye on history, because history was dangerous. The weirdness of medieval royalty, then, was cumulative. Born in public, raised by strangers, crowned into erasure, watched in life, dissected in death, remembered selectively. At no point did the royal body belong fully to itself. And yet, for all this control, something unpredictable remained. Desire, fear, love, madness, humanity leaked through the cracks. And nowhere did that humanity clash more violently with expectation than in the private lives medieval royalty was never supposed to have. In the spring of 1170, King Henry II of England received news that would trouble him far more than rebellion or invasion. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had given birth again. This in itself was not alarming. Eleanor was famously fertile. But what disturbed Henry was not the child. It was the implication of attachment. Affection between royal spouses was dangerous. In the medieval court, marriage was not an emotional bond. It was a political instrument. When love appeared within it, the results were often catastrophic, precisely because love interfered with calculation. Royal marriages were arranged years, sometimes decades, in advance. Negotiated by councils, sealed by treaties, and enforced by the logic of dynastic survival, they prioritized land, alliance, and legitimacy above all else. The bride and groom often met only shortly before the ceremony, sometimes not even then. Proxy marriages were common. A nobleman might stand in for the groom, symbolically touching the bride's hand or foot to complete the ritual. Only later would the couple meet in person. Affection was not assumed. In fact, it was discouraged. Love made rulers unpredictable. Queens who loved their husbands too openly risked being seen as manipulative. Kings who favored their wives too strongly provoked resentment among nobles who feared exclusion from influence. So emotional restraint was cultivated deliberately. Yet human desire did not vanish. It went elsewhere. Medieval kings frequently took mistresses. This was not merely tolerated, it was often expected. A virile king demonstrated divine favor. Illegitimate children could even serve political purposes, placed strategically within the nobility or church. William the Conqueror's own father had been illegitimate. Henry III of England acknowledged more than 20 illegitimate children. These offspring were both assets and liabilities. They could strengthen networks or ignite succession disputes. Queens, by contrast, were not permitted such latitude. Female sexuality was tightly controlled because legitimacy depended on certainty of paternity. A queen suspected of adultery could be imprisoned, repudiated, or executed. The most famous example, the scandal of the Tour de Nesle in early 14th century France, saw multiple royal women accused of adultery. 2 were imprisoned. 1 died in captivity. The charges may have been exaggerated or politically motivated. The punishment was real. Queens lived under constant surveillance. Ladies-in-waiting acted as companions and informants. Servants reported behavior. Letters were read. Privacy did not exist. Even marital intimacy was regulated. Royal couples were expected to produce heirs promptly. If pregnancy did not occur, blame fell on the queen. Physicians intervened, diets were adjusted, prayers intensified. If failure continued, annulment was possible. Infertility was grounds for political erasure. This pressure distorted relationships. Some royal couples developed genuine affection despite constraints. Eleanor and Henry initially did, as did Edward Thurse and Eleanor of Castile. Chroniclers noted shared grief when children died, shared journeys, shared piety. But even these bonds existed under scrutiny. When Henry II later imprisoned Eleanor during their conflict, he did not hesitate. Marriage did not protect her, nor did queens possess legal autonomy over their own bodies. Sex was duty, childbirth was obligation, miscarriage was tragedy, repeated pregnancy was expectation. The physical toll was severe. Queens frequently died young from complications of childbirth. Blanche of Castile bore at least 12 children. Isabella of France died at 46, having spent much of her adult life either pregnant or recovering. Pain was normalized. There was no anesthesia, no antibiotics. Hemorrhage was common. Infection was deadly, and yet refusal was impossible. A queen who avoided pregnancy endangered the dynasty. Royal weirdness extended beyond heterosexual norms. Medieval chronicles occasionally hint at same-sex relationships among royalty, though these were framed as moral failings rather than identities. King Edward II of England was accused of excessive attachment to Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser. Whether these relationships were sexual remains debated by historians, but contemporaries perceived them as unnatural and politically destabilizing. The issue was not desire itself, it was favoritism. Any attachment that disrupted the distribution of power was dangerous. Love was threatening because it concentrated loyalty. Royal households were built on diffusion, of favor, of access, of influence. Love created centers. Centers provoked opposition, so love was policed. Yet, despite all this, medieval royalty did experience affection, awkwardly, furtively, imperfectly. Letters survive. Margaret of Anjou wrote tenderly to Henry VI, despite his mental illness. Joan of Navarre expressed grief at separation. These fragments reveal emotional lives strained by duty, but emotional expression was always secondary to performance. Even grief had rules. When a child died, royal parents were expected to mourn briefly and move on. Excessive grief suggested weakness or divine displeasure. Children died often. Infant mortality was high even among royalty. Disease did not respect status. Each loss hardened expectations. This emotional austerity shaped character. Many rulers appeared distant, suspicious, or volatile in the sources. Chroniclers describe kings who laughed rarely, trusted poorly, and ruled harshly. This was not cruelty born of power alone. It was the result of lives lived without safety. When affection was conditional, desire regulated, and intimacy surveilled, trust eroded. The court became a place of performance, not refuge, and nowhere was performance more intense than in appearance. Because in a world where inner life was constrained, the outer body carried meaning. What one wore, how one moved, how one aged. All of it was political, and aging in particular was terrifying, because a weak body threatened the illusion of eternal authority, and nothing exposed weakness more brutally than illness. In the year 1392, King Charles VI of France rode through the forest near Le Mans when he suddenly screamed, drew his sword, and attacked his own escort. Several men were killed before he was restrained. When the king recovered, he remembered nothing. News spread rapidly. France had not merely witnessed an episode of madness, it had witnessed a rupture in the sacred body of kingship itself. In the medieval world, illness in royalty was never just medical, it was metaphysical. The health of the ruler was believed to reflect the health of the kingdom. A sick king signaled imbalance, in the body politic, in divine favor, or in the cosmic order. This belief transformed ordinary ailments into political crises. Royal illness was therefore hidden whenever possible. When concealment failed, explanation followed. Physicians invoked humoral imbalance. Clergy invoked sin or divine testing. Astrologers blamed unfavorable planetary alignments. Courtiers whispered, Illness was never neutral. Medieval medicine was built on ancient authority rather than experimentation. The four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, governed health. An excess or deficiency caused disease. Treatment aimed not to cure, but to rebalance. Bloodletting was common. Leeches were applied. Purgatives induced vomiting or diarrhea. Diets were prescribed based on temperament and season. For royalty, these treatments were relentless. A king's body was monitored obsessively. Urine was inspected daily. Pulse was felt, skin tone examined, sleep patterns recorded. The royal physician held extraordinary power and tremendous risk. Failure could cost position, reputation, or life. Despite constant attention, royal health was often poor. Medieval diets were heavy in meat, salt, and alcohol. Fresh vegetables were seasonal. Water was often unsafe. Exercise was uneven. Bursts of hunting followed by long sedentary councils. Gout was common. So were kidney stones, digestive disorders, infections, and dental disease. Toothache could incapacitate a king. Chronic pain shaped governance. Some rulers became irritable, others withdrew. Still others turned intensely religious, interpreting suffering as divine message. Henry II of England endured painful ulcers in his later years. Philip of France suffered recurring illness. Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, lived with chronic digestive problems. Yet public acknowledgement of weakness was dangerous. A king who appeared frail invited challenge. So illness was concealed behind ceremony. The king might still appear at court, supported physically, but symbolically intact. When absence was unavoidable, explanations were crafted carefully. The language mattered. A king was never sick. He was indisposed, or at prayer, or in retreat. Mental illness posed an even greater threat. Charles VI's episodes shattered the illusion of divine stability. He believed himself made of glass, refused to be touched, and sometimes did not recognize his own wife. France entered decades of factional violence. Mental illness had no place in the ideology of kingship. It could not be explained easily by humors alone. Demonic possession was suggested, sin was suspected, punishment was feared, regency became necessary, but regency undermined authority. Because if a king could not rule, who did? The medieval system had no graceful answer. Queens sometimes ruled as regents, but this provoked resistance. Councils competed, nobles armed themselves, royal illness destabilized everything. Fear of decay haunted medieval courts. Bathing practices, contrary to modern myth, were not absent, but they were cautious. Excess bathing was thought to open pores and invite illness. Royal baths were rare, ritualized, and supervised. Scents mattered. Perfumes, herbs, and incense were used to ward off disease. Bad smells were believed to cause illness. During plagues, courts fled cities to escape corrupted air. Hygiene was symbolic as much as practical. A clean king suggested order. A foul king suggested corruption. Aging terrified royalty. Wrinkles, stooped posture, trembling hands, all undermined the image of divine authority. Older kings often delegated more authority while maintaining ritual presence, but decline was inevitable. Some resisted desperately. Cosmetic practices existed: hair dye, skin ointments, perfumes. Beards were styled carefully. Clothing compensated for bodily weakness. Others embraced piety. As the body failed, the soul became emphasis. Kings founded monasteries, endowed churches, sponsored relics. Queens withdrew into devotional practices. Prayer replaced hunting. This turn toward religion was sincere and strategic. Piety reframed weakness as holiness. Yet illness remained unpredictable. Plague did not spare royalty. Edward III of England lost a daughter to the Black Death. Alfonso X of Castile died of it himself. Courts scattered, administration collapsed. Royal bodies were as vulnerable as peasant bodies. This truth haunted medieval ideology. The king was supposed to be chosen by God, yet God sent disease without distinction. The contradiction produced anxiety, and anxiety produced superstition. Astrologers calculated dangerous days, relics were carried for protection, amulets were worn beneath robes, holy water was sprinkled liberally. The royal body became a battlefield between faith and fear. Even sleep was dangerous. Nightmares were interpreted as omens. Sudden death in sleep was terrifying, proof of divine judgment without warning. Royal guards were stationed near beds, candles burned through the night, doors were guarded. Sleep was shallow, rest was incomplete. Illness shaped royal psychology profoundly. Living under constant scrutiny, fearing decay, unable to rest or withdraw, medieval royalty existed in a state of controlled vulnerability. They were elevated, but never secure. This insecurity bred paranoia, suspicion, and rigidity. It also bred cruelty. When fear governs, mercy weakens. And nowhere was this more visible than in how medieval royalty treated those closest to them, servants, courtiers, and rivals, because power, when fragile, becomes dangerous, and the weirdness of medieval royalty deepened most when fear met authority. In 1405, King Henry IV of England slept with a dagger beneath his pillow. This was not symbolic, it was practical. Henry had seized the throne from his cousin Richard II, who would later die in captivity. The act of deposition had shattered a sacred assumption of medieval kingship, that God alone removed kings. Once that boundary was crossed, no ruler felt safe again. The medieval court was the center of power, and its most dangerous location. It was where decisions were made, favors granted, and access negotiated. It was also where poison could be slipped into wine, whispers could become rebellion, and loyalty could dissolve overnight. Royalty lived surrounded by people, yet profoundly alone. Everyone near the throne wanted something, and wanting made them dangerous. Courts were crowded ecosystems of ambition. Nobles sought offices. Clergy sought influence. Relatives sought advancement. Servants sought survival. Courtiers measured every gesture, word, and glance. A smile could elevate a career. A frown could end one. Royal favor was currency, unpredictable and intoxicating. And because favor was scarce, competition was ruthless. Kings were expected to distribute patronage widely to prevent resentment. But generosity created dependency. Dependency created factions. Factions created instability. This balance was impossible to perfect, so kings watched, constantly. Spies were embedded in households, servants reported conversations, confessors listened carefully during confession, letters were intercepted. The medieval court functioned like a pressure chamber. Nothing escaped notice for long. This surveillance bred paranoia. A king who trusted too freely risked betrayal. A king who trusted no one risked isolation. Many oscillated between the two. Edward II's reliance on favorites such as Piers Gaveston enraged the nobility. His refusal to moderate personal attachment destabilized the realm and led to his eventual deposition. Favoritism was not merely emotional, it was structural. A favorite bypassed traditional channels of influence. This threatened established elites. And when elites felt threatened, violence followed. Queens were often accused of manipulating favor through intimacy. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, was blamed for conspiring with Roger Mortimer to overthrow her husband. Whether her motivations were personal, political, or survival-based remains debated. What is clear is that intimacy was power, and power attracted suspicion. Royal households were rigidly organized to control access. Chambers were layered. Outer rooms admitted many. Inner rooms admitted few. The bedchamber admitted almost no one, and those who entered gained extraordinary influence. Hence, the importance of figures like the groom of the stool. Physical closeness meant political closeness. This created strange hierarchies. A low-born servant with access to the king's chamber could outrank high nobles politically. This inversion bred resentment and violence. Courtiers competed not only for titles, but for proximity. Who could speak privately? Who could deliver messages? Who could influence mood? Mood mattered. A king's emotional state shaped policy. Irritation could delay justice. Affection could grant lands. Fear could spark repression. And kings were emotionally volatile. They lived under unrelenting stress, constant petitioning, threats, illness, surveillance. Emotional regulation was not taught. Vulnerability was punished. Outbursts were common. So were vendettas. When trust broke, punishment was severe. Medieval kings did not hesitate to imprison, exile, or execute rivals. Mercy was strategic, not sentimental. Royal justice was not blind. It was personal. A perceived slight could linger for years before being repaid. Many medieval rulers kept mental lists of debts. Forgiveness was risky. It suggested weakness. Paranoia extended beyond the court. Even family members were threats. Brothers rivaled brothers. Sons threatened fathers. Uncles schemed against nephews. The Wars of the Roses emerged from precisely this environment. A royal family fractured by claims, counterclaims, and insecurity. Blood did not guarantee loyalty. In fact, it often intensified rivalry, because royal blood meant potential kingship, and potential kingship invited elimination. Royal children were sometimes imprisoned or killed to remove claims. Others were married strategically to neutralize them. Affection could not protect. The court, then, was not a community. It was a battlefield with etiquette. Smiles concealed hostility. Politeness masked fear. Silence carried meaning, and royalty lived at its center. This environment shaped behavior profoundly. Kings learned to speak indirectly. Queens learned to observe quietly. Princes learned to conceal ambition. Emotional honesty was dangerous. Trust was conditional. Friendship was rare. The result was psychological strain. Many medieval rulers appear withdrawn, suspicious, or cruel in the sources. Chroniclers note erratic decisions, sudden reversals, and emotional volatility. This was not incompetence. It was survival behavior. To rule was to navigate constant threat. And nowhere was threat more terrifying than rebellion, because rebellion was not just political, it was theological. A rebellion implied divine disfavor, so kings reacted harshly. Punishments were public and theatrical. Traitors were drawn, hanged, beheaded. Their bodies were displayed as warnings. Violence was spectacle. Spectacle reinforced order. But spectacle also revealed fear. A secure ruler did not need constant demonstration. An insecure one did. The weirdness of medieval royalty, then, was not eccentricity. It was distortion. Human instincts twisted by impossible expectations. Love became liability. Trust became threat. Privacy became impossibility. And yet, despite this, rulers were expected to appear calm, divinely guided, and just. They performed serenity while living in panic. This contradiction wore them down. Some turned to faith, some turned to cruelty, some broke. And when they broke publicly, the consequences were catastrophic, because monarchy rested on belief. Once belief cracked, violence rushed in. The court that sustained power could destroy it, and royalty knew this. They lived not above danger, but at its center, which is why medieval kings and queens developed one final, deeply strange habit. They feared not the enemy far away. They feared the room they were standing in. On the morning of October 25th, 1415, King Henry V of England knelt in the mud near the village of Agincourt and prayed. He did not pray privately. He prayed in full view of his army. The prayer was deliberate, carefully staged. Chroniclers would later describe it in detail. Henry confessed his sins, asked for mercy, and ordered the removal of all outward signs of pride from his soldiers' armor. This was not spontaneous devotion. It was political theology. In medieval Europe, faith was not merely belief. It was infrastructure. It shaped authority, explained catastrophe, and stabilized power in a world that otherwise made little sense. For royalty, faith was both refuge and weapon. Kings were expected to be pious. Queens were expected to be devout. But beyond expectation, religion provided the only language capable of justifying the unbearable pressures of royal life. Why rule? Why suffer? Why obey? The answer was always the same: God. Medieval kingship was inseparable from Christian cosmology. The king ruled by divine will. This belief was reinforced constantly in coronation rituals, sermons, public prayers, and law. A king was not just a political leader. He was God's lieutenant on earth. This elevated status came with terrifying consequences. If the king succeeded, God was pleased. If the king failed, God was angry. Every famine, plague, military defeat, or rebellion carried theological weight. Royalty internalized this deeply. Kings prayed obsessively, queens fasted, courts were saturated with ritual, mass was attended daily, relics were collected, saints were invoked. This was not superstition alone, it was anxiety management. When outcomes could not be controlled, meaning had to be imposed. Royal piety was highly visible. Kings endowed monasteries and churches lavishly. Queens sponsored convents. Royal chapels employed choirs whose music filled palaces daily. Prayer structured time. The liturgical calendar dictated the rhythm of the court. Feast days, fast days, saints' days. Even war paused for holy observances. Yet faith was not purely sincere. It was strategic. A pious king appeared legitimate. A sinful king appeared dangerous. Public acts of devotion could silence critics, justify harsh measures, or absolve failures. After defeats, kings blamed their own sins, publicly, while privately regrouping. Confession became politics. But faith also imposed restraint. Christian doctrine emphasized humility, mercy, and justice, ideals that clashed with the realities of rule. Kings navigated this tension constantly. Some resolved it brutally. Others internalized it painfully. Henry V framed war against France as a just and holy cause. His piety enhanced authority. Richard II, by contrast, emphasized sacral kingship to such an extent that he alienated the nobility. Too much sanctity could be as dangerous as too little. Queens often embodied faith more intensely than kings. Their role as intercessors, between king and God, king and people, was emphasized. Queens prayed publicly for peace, fertility, and mercy. When disasters struck, queens were expected to plead. Failure to appear devout could destroy reputation. Faith also structured gendered expectations. Female piety was associated with submission and endurance. Male piety with leadership and righteous action. Deviation provoked suspicion. Joan of Arc's success was inseparable from her faith, and her execution was justified through theological language. Faith empowered and constrained. Royal weirdness deepened in moments of religious extremity. During crises, rulers turned to ritual escalation, processions multiplied, flagellants appeared, relics were paraded through cities. During the Black Death, kings ordered public penance. Entire courts walked barefoot. Alms increased. These acts soothed fear. Briefly, but when catastrophe continued, doubt followed. If God punished despite prayer, what did that mean? Some rulers became more extreme. Others grew cynical. The late medieval period saw increasing tension between outward ritual and inner belief. Some kings became intensely devout. Others treated religion instrumentally, yet none could escape it. Royal decisions were framed theologically. Oaths were sworn on relics. Treaties invoked divine witness. Breaking an oath was not just dishonorable, it was damnable. This fear shaped diplomacy. It also shaped law. Kings issued edicts framed as divine justice. Punishments were described as moral correction. Rebellion was sin. Royal authority was moralized, and morality was enforced publicly. Executions followed ritual. Confession was offered. Bodies were displayed not only as deterrence, but as moral instruction. Death taught lessons. This made violence acceptable. Even mercy was ritualized. A king who pardoned did so publicly, magnifying his grace. Mercy reinforced hierarchy. Faith turned emotion into policy, and policy into theater. For royalty, belief was not private conviction. It was survival strategy. Yet faith also offered genuine solace. In a life without privacy, religion provided interior space. Prayer was one of the few moments when a ruler could speak without witnesses, at least human ones. Some kings wrote devotional texts. Others collected books of hours. Queens corresponded with mystics. These private practices reveal exhaustion. The burden of symbolic existence drove rulers inward, but even inner faith was monitored. Confessors reported concerns. Spiritual advisors influenced decisions. The line between conscience and counsel blurred. Royal faith was never free. It was embedded, like everything else. And as medieval Europe moved toward the late Middle Ages, something began to shift. The authority of tradition weakened. Doubt grew. Institutions strained. And royalty, already distorted by centuries of pressure, faced a world changing faster than ritual could stabilize. The weird life of medieval royalty was about to become dangerous in a new way, because belief, once cracked, does not simply fade, it fractures, and fractures spread. In January 1461, as snow fell across England, King Henry VI wandered silently through his palace, unaware that his kingdom was dissolving around him. He did not issue orders, he did not ask questions, he did not react. His courtiers watched in fear. Henry had ruled for decades, yet at this moment he did not know he was king. This was no longer illness hidden behind ritual. It was collapse made visible, and visibility was fatal. Medieval monarchy depended not only on power, lineage, or ritual, but on distance. The king had to feel elevated, set apart, mysterious, chosen. Once that distance eroded, reverence gave way to judgment, and judgment was ruthless. By the late Middle Ages, cracks had begun to appear in the sacred architecture of kingship. Long wars drained treasuries, repeated plagues shattered faith, literacy spread, bureaucracy expanded, nobles grew more assertive, cities demanded privileges, The king was no longer the sole center of meaning, and when kings failed visibly, they were no longer forgiven. Henry II's mental collapse coincided with military disaster in France. Territories were lost, taxes rose, nobles fought among themselves. The king's inability to act transformed sympathy into contempt. Contempt was new. Earlier kings had been feared, even hated, but rarely mocked. Mockery was lethal. Satirical verses circulated, jokes spread quietly through taverns and markets. Chroniclers became less deferential. Royal authority was questioned not just morally, but competently. A king who could not rule was no longer sacred. He was a problem. This shift marked a profound change in the experience of royalty. Earlier medieval kings lived under pressure, but the ideology surrounding them remained intact. By the 15th century, ideology itself was unstable. People still believed in divine order, but they also believed in results. Failure demanded explanation, and explanations became less forgiving. Royal weirdness, once accepted as the cost of sacral power, now appeared dysfunctional. Excessive ritual looked out of touch. Piety looked performative. Isolation looked incompetence. Kings who withdrew were criticized. Kings who trusted favorites were resented. Kings who hesitated were blamed. The margin for error vanished. Queens, too, suffered this shift. Margaret of Anjou, wife of Henry VI, ruled aggressively during her husband's incapacity. She raised armies, negotiated alliances, and fought openly. She was competent. She was also vilified. Chroniclers portrayed her as unnatural, cruel, and domineering. A woman exercising visible power violated expectations deeply ingrained in medieval culture. The criticism was not subtle. She was blamed for the war itself. Royal women, once shielded by ritual distance, became targets. As sacred authority weakened, gender norms hardened. Royal children were no longer simply heirs, they became pawns. During the Wars of the Roses, boys were imprisoned, exiled, or murdered because their existence threatened stability. Childhood ceased to protect. The Tower of London filled with royal blood. This violence was not unprecedented, but it was more frequent, more explicit, and more openly justified. The language changed. Rebels no longer framed themselves as servants of the king misled by advisers. They framed themselves as correctors of tyranny. This mattered. It meant the king himself could be wrong. Wrongness destroyed sacrality. The deposition of Richard II in 1399 had already broken a taboo. By the late 15th century, that taboo lay in pieces. Kings could be judged, kings could be removed, kings could be killed. Royal paranoia intensified, security increased, surveillance tightened. Punishments grew harsher, but fear could not restore belief. Royal weirdness, once hidden behind reverence, became grotesque in the public eye. Eccentric behavior invited satire, ritual excess invited resentment, silence invited suspicion. The court no longer felt like a mystery, it felt like dysfunction. Chroniclers adopted a harsher tone. Where earlier writers praised piety, later writers analyzed incompetence. Moral judgment gave way to political critique. The king became human, disastrously so. And humanity, in a system built on transcendence, was weakness. This transition reshaped royal psychology. Kings became more guarded, more calculating, less inclined to spiritual openness. Bureaucracy replaced charisma. Law replaced ritual. The seeds of early modern monarchy were planted, but medieval royalty had to live through the transition. They existed in an in-between world, bound by ancient expectations but judged by emerging standards. This produced profound stress. Some adapted. Edward IV of England embraced display, wealth, and control. He cultivated loyalty through rewards and spectacle. Others failed. Richard III attempted reform, but could not escape suspicion. His physical deformity, real or exaggerated, became symbolic of moral corruption in hostile accounts. Bodies mattered again. Appearance returned as destiny. Royal weirdness now attracted interpretation rather than acceptance. Every quirk became evidence. Every silence became guilt. Every ritual became pretense. This scrutiny reshaped the meaning of kingship. Royal life grew lonelier, advisors were fewer, trust was rarer, fear was constant. The medieval world that had sustained sacral monarchy was dissolving, and royalty, once at the center of meaning, now stood exposed. The crown no longer transformed the person, it magnified the flaws. This was not yet the end of medieval royalty, but it was the end of its spell. The weird life of royalty had always been unnatural. Now it was untenable. And as Europe moved toward a new age, the question was no longer how a king embodied God's will. It was whether he deserved to rule at all. In April 1485, as King Richard III rode toward Bosworth Field, he wore a crown atop his helmet. This was not vanity, it was necessity. Richard knew that his claim to the throne was fragile. He ruled amid rumor, suspicion, and hostility. The crown on his head was a visual argument, a declaration that he was king not merely by force, but by right. When he fell in battle, the crown fell with him. It was found in the mud and placed on the head of Henry Tudor. The medieval monarchy did not end that day, but something essential died with Richard. For centuries, royalty had lived as institutions embodied in flesh. Kings and queens were not simply people who ruled. They were symbols that absorbed meaning, fear, hope, and belief. Their lives were distorted by this role from birth to death, and by the late medieval period, the distortion had become visible. Royalty had always been weird, ritualized, surveilled, constrained, exposed. But what made medieval royal life uniquely strange was not extravagance, it was totality. There was no boundary between the self and the role. A medieval king did not have power. He was power. His body signified legitimacy. His health signified stability. His marriage signified alliance. His children signified continuity. His death signified danger. Modern observers often imagine medieval royalty as living above ordinary people. In truth, they lived under extraordinary weight. They could not choose solitude. They could not choose love freely. They could not choose anonymity. They could not choose withdrawal. Even retreat into religion remained public. Even silence was interpreted. Their lives were not lived forward. They were lived outward. Every action was read. Every gesture was judged. Every weakness was magnified. This produced behaviors that now appear eccentric, paranoid, or cruel. But these behaviors were not personal failings. They were adaptations to an impossible environment. A king who trusted no one survived longer. A queen who suppressed emotion endured scrutiny. A ruler who punished harshly deterred rebellion. The medieval system rewarded rigidity. It punished softness. And yet, despite all the constraints, humanity persisted. Kings loved badly. Queens grieved quietly. Princes feared invisibility. Princesses feared replacement. The sources are filled with moments of exhaustion, letters asking for solitude, chronicles noting withdrawal, accounts of rulers weeping in prayer. These were not signs of weakness, they were signs of strain. Royal weirdness was the cost of holding together a world that lacked modern institutions. There was no professional bureaucracy at first, no impersonal state, no constitutional limits. The king's body substituted for systems. That substitution demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice accumulated across generations. By the end of the Middle Ages, that accumulation became unsustainable. As institutions strengthened, law courts, parliaments, bureaucracies, the need for the king's body to carry everything diminished. But the expectations remained. Royalty was trapped between worlds, still sacred, but no longer unquestionable, still powerful, but increasingly constrained, still watched, but less forgiven. This was the most dangerous position of all. Some rulers adapted by redefining kingship. They emphasized law over ritual, administration over charisma, distance over intimacy. Others failed. Those who clung too tightly to sacred mystique appeared delusional. Those who embraced humanity appeared weak. The medieval royal life, strange from the beginning, became tragic at the end. Not because royalty disappeared, but because it changed. The weirdness did not vanish. It transformed. The Renaissance and early modern period would bring new forms of royal performance, absolutism, spectacle, court theater, all attempts to rebuild distance in a world that no longer believed automatically. But medieval royalty had lived without that option. They carried belief inside their bodies. They suffered for it, and when belief cracked, they were crushed beneath it. The final irony is this: medieval kings and queens are remembered either as monsters or saints, rarely as people. Yet if we strip away the ceremony, the theology, the chronicler's judgments, what remains is a life few would choose. A life without privacy, a life without safety, a life where love was dangerous, a life where illness was political, a life where death did not end responsibility. The crown did not free, it consumed. That is the true weirdness of medieval royalty. Not the pageantry, not the cruelty, not the superstition, but the fact that for centuries entire societies asked a single human body to hold the weight of order itself, and then blamed that body when the weight became too heavy to bear. In 1363, King John II of France sat down to eat and did nothing for several minutes. The food had already been prepared. The table had been laid with linen imported from Flanders. Silver dishes gleamed. Wine waited in sealed vessels. Servants stood motionless, and yet the king did not touch a single item. He could not, because eating, for medieval royalty, was not a private act of nourishment. It was a public demonstration of order. Only once the proper officials had arrived, the carver, the cupbearer, the steward, the taster, could the ritual begin. Each role had a precise function. Each movement followed inherited custom. The carver announced the dish. The taster sampled it. The cupbearer poured the wine. The king waited. This delay was not inefficiency, it was legitimacy. A king who ate casually appeared unsafe. A king who rushed appeared undisciplined. A king who ate alone appeared suspicious. Meals reinforced hierarchy. Where one sat, who stood, who served, and who watched mattered as much as the food itself. Rank was visible in posture and proximity. Even silence carried meaning. Royal dining halls were not convivial. They were theaters of restraint. This made daily life exhausting. Medieval royalty spent astonishing amounts of time doing nothing, waiting for ceremonies to begin, waiting for officials to arrive, waiting for prayers to conclude, waiting for protocol to permit action. Waiting was built into the system, because haste suggested disorder. The king could not simply wake up and begin the day. Rising from bed was ritualized. The lever required witnesses. The king's clothing was selected and presented in sequence. Even shoes were handed ceremonially. Clothing itself was political. Fabrics were regulated by sumptuary law. Colors conveyed rank. Certain furs were restricted to royalty. A king dressed improperly undermined hierarchy. Heavy garments restricted movement. Layers trapped heat. Crowns caused headaches. Jewels were uncomfortable. But discomfort was irrelevant. Appearance was authority. Queens endured even more physical constraint. Corsetry, elaborate headdresses, and layered gowns limited motion. Pregnancy complicated everything. Childbirth did not excuse ritual. A queen might receive visitors hours after delivery. Pain was invisible. Time itself was not owned by royalty. The royal day was structured by bells, prayers, councils, meals, audiences, and ceremonies. Free hours barely existed. Solitude required justification. Boredom was constant. Chroniclers occasionally hint at it. Kings hunting obsessively, gambling excessively, or engaging in repetitive devotions. These were not hobbies. They were escape attempts. Yet escape was limited. A king could not wander freely. Movement required escorts. Hunting trips involved hundreds of attendants. Even leisure was labor. This rigidity shaped psychology. The inability to act spontaneously produced frustration. Emotional suppression became habitual. Impulse became dangerous. Royal weirdness was often simply the result of repression. When release occurred, it appeared extreme. Outbursts, cruel punishments, obsessive rituals, sudden generosity, sudden withdrawal. These behaviors were not eccentric, they were pressure leaks. And beneath all of this lay a quieter strain. Financial anxiety. In the year 1294, King Edward I of England, one of the most militarily successful monarchs of the Middle Ages, faced a problem that no coronation ritual could conceal. He was almost completely out of money. This was not unusual. In fact, it was the default condition of medieval royalty. Despite the popular image of kings surrounded by endless treasure, medieval monarchs were chronically short of cash, perpetually indebted, and constantly negotiating with creditors whose cooperation mattered as much as any noble's loyalty. The crown symbolized wealth, but the institution itself was financially fragile, resting on a patchwork of feudal obligations, extraordinary taxes, borrowed funds, and improvised accounting that barely sustained the demands placed upon it. Royal income was limited by structure. Kings did not possess modern taxation systems. Ordinary revenue came primarily from royal lands, feudal dues, judicial fines, and customs duties, all of which fluctuated wildly with harvests, trade cycles, and political stability. Extraordinary revenue, the money required for wars, ransoms, marriages, and crises, depended on consent from nobles, clergy, or towns, each of whom extracted concessions in return. Power, therefore, was never absolute in financial terms. Edward I's campaigns in Wales, Scotland, and France consumed resources at a rate that ordinary revenues could not sustain. He borrowed heavily from Italian banking families, such as the Riccardi of Lucca, who effectively underwrote English warfare for years. When Edward defaulted, the Riccardi collapsed, demonstrating a reality medieval kings preferred not to acknowledge. Royal power depended on private finance. This dependence shaped royal behavior profoundly. Kings spent enormous amounts of time negotiating money, issuing grants, confirming privileges, and appeasing creditors, even while publicly performing magnificence. A court might glitter with cloth of gold and jeweled plate, while behind the scenes officials delayed payments, reassigned debts, and quietly confiscated assets to remain solvent. The contradiction was exhausting. A king could not appear poor. Poverty suggested weakness, and weakness invited challenge. Yet extravagance accelerated debt. The solution was display without liquidity, spectacle financed by promises. Royal wardrobes alone could consume staggering sums. Clothing was not vanity, it was legitimacy made visible. A king who dressed plainly undermined hierarchy. A queen who repeated gowns appeared diminished. Garments were worn briefly, then gifted, pawned, or repurposed. Jewels circulated constantly, serving as movable wealth and collateral. Even crowns were sometimes pawned. The crown of England itself would later be mortgaged to foreign lenders. Sacred regalia became financial instruments, stripped temporarily of symbolism in moments of necessity. War magnified everything. Campaigns required paying soldiers, provisioning horses, securing supplies, and compensating allies. Medieval armies were not national institutions, they were contractual forces. Payment failures led to desertion, pillage, or rebellion. Kings who could not pay were kings who could not fight. This made debt existential. Ransom was another financial nightmare. Captured kings were liabilities of the highest order. John II of France, taken prisoner by the English at Poitiers in 1356, was ransomed for an astronomical sum that crippled France's economy for years. To raise the money, taxes soared, estates were mortgaged, and resentment spread. The king's body had become a debt instrument. Queens, too, were embedded in this system. Their dowries were essential financial infusions, negotiated as carefully as treaties. A queen's marriage could stabilize a treasury or bankrupt it. Failure to deliver promised dowry payments sparked diplomatic crises. Royal households were expensive beyond imagination. Hundreds of mouths required feeding daily. Horses required constant care. Staff demanded wages or privileges. Dismissal created enemies. Retention created expense. Nothing was efficient. Corruption flourished. Officials skimmed funds. Accounts were falsified. Offices were sold. Kings were aware of this and tolerated it to a degree, because enforcement risked alienating the very administrators upon whom governance depended. Financial stress shaped royal justice. Fines were imposed aggressively. Jewish communities were taxed relentlessly until their expulsion became financially expedient. Justice became revenue extraction, blurring moral authority. This contradiction damaged legitimacy. Subjects noticed. Resentment grew when taxation funded court luxury while famine stalked the countryside. Revolts erupted, the Jacquerie in France, the Peasants' Revolt in England, fueled in part by fiscal pressure. Kings responded with repression and concessions, oscillating between force and compromise. The myth of infinite royal wealth persisted because it had to. If people believed the king was poor, belief itself collapsed. And yet, kings lived with constant financial anxiety, juggling obligations while maintaining performance. This anxiety compounded existing pressures: surveillance, illness, ritual, fear. The weirdness of medieval royalty included living in permanent contradiction, appearing all-powerful while negotiating loans, displaying splendor while calculating arrears, commanding obedience while begging for funds. This financial fragility contributed to emotional volatility. Anger flared when funds ran dry. Cruelty intensified under stress. Favoritism increased as kings rewarded creditors with access and influence. Money reshaped intimacy, and money reshaped justice. Royal life was not sustained by wealth, it was sustained by belief, credit, and delay. Eventually, delay failed, and when it did, the consequences were often violent, because nothing exposed the limits of kingship more clearly than the moment when the treasury was empty, the army unpaid, and the crown still demanded obedience. That was when subjects learned a dangerous lesson. The king was not infinite, he was constrained. And once that knowledge spread, ritual alone could not contain it. On a spring day in 1314, beneath the walls of Paris, a man named Jacques de Molay was burned alive. He was not a common criminal. He was the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, once among the most powerful military and financial institutions in Christendom. His execution had been ordered by King Philip IV of France, a ruler renowned not for mercy, but for precision, calculation, and an iron understanding of power. The fire was public. It had to be. Medieval justice, especially royal justice, was never primarily about correction. It was about demonstration. Punishment was not simply a response to crime. It was a message sent outward, carefully staged so that no one misunderstood who possessed authority, who enforced order, and what happened to those who challenged it. For royalty, justice was theater, and theater was survival. Medieval kings were expected to be just rulers, but justice did not mean impartiality in the modern sense. It meant the maintenance of order according to divine and social hierarchy. Equality before the law was not an aspiration. Hierarchy was the law. Royal justice operated on two levels. On the surface, it followed procedure: courts, oaths, witnesses, written records. Beneath that surface lay discretion. The king's will could override process, especially in cases involving treason, heresy, or threats to stability. Treason, in particular, was defined expansively. It did not require action alone. Speech could be treason. Silence could be treason. Association could be treason. Intention, inferred by enemies, could be treason. Because the king embodied the realm, any threat to him threatened everything. This elasticity made royal justice terrifying. Punishments were deliberately spectacular. Executions were public. Bodies were displayed. Heads were mounted on gates. Limbs were separated and sent to different towns as warnings. The purpose was not cruelty for its own sake. It was memory. Subjects were meant to remember. Royalty understood fear as a governing tool, especially in an age with outstanding police forces or centralized enforcement. Order was maintained not by constant presence, but by occasional unforgettable violence. The paradox was that kings were also expected to be merciful. Mercy demonstrated confidence. A ruler secure in power could afford restraint. Pardons were therefore political acts, often issued publicly to reinforce the image of benevolence. This balance between terror and mercy was difficult to maintain. Too much cruelty bred hatred. Too much leniency bred contempt. Royal weirdness emerged in the oscillation. Kings who ruled through fear often justified it through religious language. Punishment was framed as moral correction. Executions became sermons enacted in flesh. The church participated willingly. Confessors urged repentance before death. Clergy accompanied condemned prisoners. Souls were the final concern, even as bodies were destroyed. This collaboration reinforced authority, yet royal justice was deeply personal. Kings remembered insults, queens remembered slights. Grievances lingered for years. When punishment came, it often carried emotional residue disguised as legal necessity. The case of the Templars illustrates this clearly. Philip IV's campaign against them combined financial desperation, political ambition, and genuine fear of an institution he could not fully control. The charges of heresy were dubious. The trials were coerced. The outcome was predetermined. Justice was performance masking necessity. The same pattern appeared across Europe. In England, the punishment of traitors during periods of unrest grew increasingly brutal. During the reigns of Edward II and Richard II, executions escalated in visibility and symbolism as authority weakened. Weak kings punished harder. Strong kings punished less often, but no less decisively. Queens participated in justice indirectly but powerfully. As intercessors, they could plead for mercy. As symbols of order, their presence at judgments mattered. A queen's silence could condemn. Royal children learned these lessons early. They attended executions. They observed trials. They internalized the link between authority and fear. Compassion was permitted, privately. Publicly, firmness was required. This exposure shaped moral development. Medieval royalty did not grow up insulated from violence. They were educated within it. Punishment also served as financial tool. Confiscated lands replenished treasuries. Fines funded courts. Justice paid for itself. This blurred legitimacy. Subjects increasingly recognized that law served power more than fairness. Resentment grew, especially among towns and lesser nobility. As literacy expanded, legal arguments circulated. Appeals to custom, charter, and privilege multiplied. Royal justice faced scrutiny. The king was no longer the sole arbiter of right. This challenged the theatrical model. Spectacle still worked, but less reliably. When fear failed, rebellion followed, and rebellion forced harsher response. This cycle intensified through the late Middle Ages, hardening royal behavior and alienating subjects. Kings became trapped between necessity and reputation. The weirdness of medieval royalty included knowing that justice must appear divine while functioning politically, that punishment must deter while risking backlash, and that mercy must soothe without undermining authority. Justice was never abstract. It was embodied. In the king's voice, in the queen's presence, in the condemned's body, and every act of justice left residue. Fear accumulated. Resentment deepened, memory lingered, which is why medieval rulers obsessed over legacy. They feared not only rebellion in life, but judgment after death, because justice, once enacted, never fully disappeared. It echoed, and in that echo, the limits of royal power became audible. In the year 1254, Blanche of Castile, Queen Mother of France, summoned the royal council and announced a decision that stunned many of the men present. She would rule in her own name until her son returned, and she would tolerate no challenge to that authority. This was not a rebellion against medieval norms. It was their fulfillment. The medieval queen is often remembered through a narrow lens: passive consort, pious mother, decorative figure beside the throne. Yet this image collapses under scrutiny. Queens were not marginal to power. They were embedded within it, constrained by gendered expectations, yet often exercising authority in ways that were indirect, resilient, and deeply consequential. What made the life of a medieval queen particularly strange was that she was expected to be simultaneously visible and silent, influential and obedient, powerful and unthreatening. The balance was almost impossible to maintain. Queens ruled, but never openly claimed to rule. Their authority flowed through proximity, to the king, to heirs, to court networks, to religious institutions. They acted as mediators, brokers, and stabilizers in systems that were otherwise brittle. When kings traveled, fought, fell ill, or died, queens often governed, sometimes for years. Yet this governance was always provisional. A queen's legitimacy rested on role, not right. She ruled for someone else, a husband, a son, a dynasty. Any suggestion that she ruled instead of them provoked hostility. This made queens extraordinarily cautious. Their power was expressed through correspondence rather than proclamation, through patronage rather than command, through influence rather than decree. They cultivated allies quietly. They intervened selectively. They framed decisions as necessity rather than ambition. And still they were accused of manipulation. Queens lived under harsher moral scrutiny than kings. A king's cruelty could be justified as firmness. A queen's firmness was labeled unnatural. A king's lover was tolerated. A queen's alleged lover was catastrophic. Sexual reputation was political capital. A queen accused of adultery did not merely dishonor herself. She destabilized succession, cast doubt on heirs, and threatened the legitimacy of the entire realm. As a result, accusations were common weapons. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, was vilified not only for her political actions, but for violating expectations of feminine submission. Her alliance with Roger Mortimer was framed as sexual corruption, even when evidence was ambiguous. Gendered language did the work of delegitimization. Queens who succeeded politically were rarely praised as capable. They were described as cunning, cold, or dangerous. Queens who failed were blamed as weak, emotional, or disruptive. There was no safe category. Even motherhood, often idealized, was fraught. Producing heirs strengthened a queen's position, but also trapped her. Each pregnancy endangered her life. Each son became a potential rival to others. Each daughter became a bargaining chip. Grief was constant. Queens lost children frequently, yet were expected to recover quickly and resume reproductive duty. Excessive mourning suggested emotional instability. Insufficient mourning suggested coldness. Maternal feeling had to be calibrated. Queens also navigated courts that were not their own. Marriage often meant exile. A foreign-born queen arrived without local allies, surrounded by suspicion. Her language, customs, and advisors were scrutinized. Xenophobia intensified in times of crisis. Foreign queens were blamed easily. Margaret of Anjou was condemned not only for political decisions, but for being French. Her failures were attributed to foreignness as much as incompetence. Queens responded by building parallel power structures. They maintained separate households. They cultivated ladies-in-waiting from influential families. They patronized religious houses that offered loyalty and refuge. They used gifts strategically. Religion offered queens a sanctioned avenue of authority. As patrons of convents, founders of charities, and exemplars of piety, queens could shape moral discourse. This moral capital translated into political influence, particularly during crises. When queens pleaded publicly for mercy, it reinforced the image of compassion while allowing kings to preserve authority. When queens retreated into piety, it signaled stability. Yet piety could also be subversive. Queens who embraced religious life too fully withdrew from dynastic expectations. Some were accused of neglect, others were suspected of dissent. Everything a queen did was interpreted. This relentless interpretation shaped behavior. Queens learned to mask intent, to speak carefully, to act slowly, to endure insult without response. The weirdness of royal womanhood lay in this constant self-regulation. Queens were trained to survive hostility rather than confront it. Some did more. Eleanor of Aquitaine defied norms repeatedly, ruling territories, leading armies, rebelling against her husband, and shaping culture. She paid for it with years of imprisonment. Her survival was exceptional. Most queens endured quietly. Their contributions are visible only indirectly, in preserved letters, in foundations that outlived them, in sons who ruled competently, in crises that did not erupt. Silence was success, yet silence also erased. Historical narratives often attribute stability to kings alone, ignoring the labor of queens who managed households, mediated disputes, secured alliances, and absorbed blame. This erasure reinforces misunderstanding. Queens were not anomalies in medieval power. They were essential components of it. Their lives were weirder than kings in one crucial respect. They exercised power without ever being allowed to admit it. They ruled invisibly, and invisibility was dangerous, because invisible power is always suspected, and suspicion was the permanent condition of medieval royalty. In the winter of 1327, a boy of 14 stood silently while his father was stripped of the crown. Edward III of England watched as Edward II, once king, was deposed, imprisoned, and soon after murdered. The boy was crowned shortly thereafter, elevated not because he was ready, but because the system required a body to carry authority. This moment reveals one of the strangest and most brutal features of medieval royalty. Royal children existed not primarily as individuals, but as contingencies. Every medieval dynasty required heirs, but it also required spares. Sons beyond the first were both insurance and threat. Their existence stabilized succession while simultaneously endangering it. A healthy spare reassured the realm. An ambitious spare destabilized it. This contradiction shaped royal childhood profoundly. The firstborn prince was trained for rule. Younger sons were trained for usefulness or removal. Some were steered toward the church, where vows eliminated their claim. Others were granted lands, titles, or marriages that tied them to the crown without empowering them too fully. This balance was delicate. Too much independence invited rivalry. Too little invited resentment. Many younger princes lived lives of constrained frustration, aware that they possessed royal blood but lacked royal destiny. Chroniclers describe these men as restless, violent, or deeply pious, adaptations to a life of suspended authority. The church became a common solution. Placing surplus sons in bishoprics or abbeys neutralized claims while preserving status. Yet this solution had consequences. Princes elevated to ecclesiastical office without vocation often resented their confinement. Some became corrupt, others became political agents within the church. Religion absorbed dynastic excess. Not all surplus children were sons. Royal daughters faced different constraints. They were married strategically, often young, often far away, and often repeatedly if widowed. Their purpose was alliance, not continuity. Yet daughters could become dynastic linchpins. When male lines failed, daughters transmitted claims that sparked wars. The 100 Years' War itself emerged partly from disputes over whether claims through women were valid. Thus, royal daughters existed in a liminal space, dismissed until suddenly essential. This instability made their upbringing paradoxical. They were educated to be obedient wives, yet carried potential to destabilize kingdoms. They were taught submission, yet embodied inheritance. Fear followed them. Some royal children were removed entirely. Imprisonment of potential rivals was common. Castles, towers, monasteries became holding spaces for inconvenient bloodlines. These children grew up isolated, under surveillance. Their futures deliberately narrowed. The most famous example, the princes in the Tower, is only the most visible instance of a widespread practice. Royal childhood was not protected by innocence. It was shaped by calculation. Affection was dangerous. To love a child too openly invited accusations of favoritism. To protect a child too fiercely invited suspicion. Royal parents learned to distance themselves emotionally. This did not mean they felt nothing. Letters reveal concern, grief, and fear. But expression was restrained. Children died frequently. Disease did not discriminate. Royal nurseries were not immune to plague, fever, or infection. Each death recalibrated succession and reshaped political calculations. This constant loss hardened royal households. Survivors grew up surrounded by absence. They learned early that existence itself was provisional. Some internalized this and became ruthless. Others became withdrawn. A few rebelled spectacularly. Rebellion by royal sons was common. Henry, the young king, rebelled against Henry II. Sons rose against fathers across Europe. These conflicts were framed as political disputes, but fueled by emotional deprivation and structural frustration. A prince raised without autonomy sought it violently. The system created its own instability. Royal children were never allowed to be ordinary. Games were supervised. Friendships were political. Education was relentless. Discipline was severe. Punishment reinforced hierarchy. Children learned obedience not through affection, but through consequence. This upbringing produced rulers who were often emotionally stunted, suspicious, or impulsive. The weirdness of medieval royalty was thus generational. Each generation inherited not only power, but trauma. Kings who had watched fathers deposed ruled anxiously. Queens who had been traded as children guarded their offspring fiercely. Princes raised in fear governed through control. The past shaped the future relentlessly. Royal children who never ruled left faint traces in history. Footnotes, marginal mentions, sudden disappearances. Yet their lives mattered deeply in shaping the behavior of those who did rule. They were cautionary examples. They reminded kings what happened to the unnecessary. They reminded queens of vulnerability. They reminded courts that blood alone did not protect. In this environment, survival was success. To reach adulthood without exile, imprisonment, or forced vocation was achievement enough. Rule was secondary. The weird life of medieval royalty was not confined to the throne. It extended into nurseries, schools, monasteries, and towers, places where children learned that being born royal was not privilege alone. It was exposure, and exposure began early. In the year 1307, as King Philip IV of France moved decisively against the Knights Templar, rumors began circulating almost immediately. Not merely about the order, but about the king himself. Whispers spread through Paris that Philip was greedy, sacrilegious, even cursed. Some claimed he was punishing the Templars not for heresy, but to erase his own debts. Others suggested divine retribution would follow. When his sons later died young and his dynasty faltered, chroniclers quietly connected the events. In the medieval world, reputation was not background noise, it was power. Royal authority did not depend solely on force or law. It depended on belief, and belief was shaped by story. Stories did not require proof. They required plausibility, repetition, and emotional resonance. Rumor thrived precisely because medieval societies were intensely social, largely oral, and deeply suspicious of visible power. Kings and queens could not control rumor completely, but they tried constantly. Royal life unfolded beneath a permanent cloud of interpretation. Every action generated commentary. Every silence invited speculation. And because literacy was spreading unevenly, rumor crossed boundaries easily, carried by merchants, pilgrims, clergy, and soldiers. Scandal was not accidental, it was political. Accusations of sexual misconduct were among the most powerful tools available. They attacked legitimacy directly. A queen accused of adultery threatened dynastic certainty. A king accused of unnatural desire threatened moral order. Whether such accusations were true mattered less than whether they were believable. The Tour de Nesle affair illustrates this perfectly. In 1314, the daughters-in-law of Philip IV were accused of adultery. 2 were imprisoned. 1 died in captivity. The scandal shattered the moral authority of the Capetian dynasty and cast doubt on succession. Modern historians debate the truth of the accusations. Medieval politics did not. The accusation alone was enough. Scandal functioned as social verdict. Royal sexuality, already tightly controlled, became a primary site of attack. Kings' mistresses were tolerated until they appeared politically disruptive. Queens' imagined lovers were catastrophic. Even physical appearance became scandalous. Richard III's body was described by hostile chroniclers as deformed, twisted, and monstrous, a moral judgment rendered in flesh. Whether these descriptions were exaggerated or fabricated is secondary to their effect. The body became narrative. Royal weirdness intensified because nothing was private and nothing was neutral. To rule was to be watched, not just by courtiers, but by storytellers. Kings responded by attempting to shape reputation deliberately. Chronicles were commissioned. Monasteries were endowed to pray and to write. Poets were patronized. Heraldry was standardized. Public rituals were staged to reinforce desired images. This was early propaganda. But propaganda competed with gossip, and gossip was agile. It adapted quickly to events. When disasters struck, famine, plague, military defeat, rumor searched for cause. Divine punishment was a popular explanation. Personal sin was an easy target. Kings who suffered repeated misfortune were rumored to be cursed. Queens who failed to produce heirs were suspected of sterility, witchcraft, or moral failing. Silence worsened everything. Royal withdrawal was interpreted as guilt or incompetence. Excessive visibility appeared defensive. Every response risked misinterpretation. Some rulers leaned into reputation aggressively. Edward IV cultivated an image of strength, beauty, and success. His court emphasized luxury and confidence. His physical presence mattered. Others failed to manage narrative. Henry II's piety, once praised, became a liability when paired with failure. His withdrawal was reinterpreted as weakness. Rumors multiplied. Reputation could undo reigns, and once damaged, it was almost impossible to repair. The medieval world did not forget easily. Memory was preserved in song, sermon, and story. Chronicles were copied and recopied. A single accusation could echo for generations. This made royal anxiety rational. Fear of rumor shaped behavior. Rulers avoided certain associations. Queens restricted contact. Kings limited trust. Marriages were delayed or hurried to silence speculation. Yet rumor could not be eliminated. It thrived on uncertainty, and medieval royalty lived inside uncertainty. The weirdness of royal life included constant awareness that one's image did not belong to oneself. It belonged to the collective imagination. A king might rule wisely and be remembered as cruel. A queen might act prudently and be remembered as manipulative. A prince might hesitate and be remembered as cowardly. History was not neutral. It was shaped by survival, allegiance, and resentment. Royalty understood this intuitively, which is why so much effort went into controlling memory. Tombs were designed carefully. Effigies idealized features. Inscriptions selected virtues. Posthumous reputations were curated. Even death was not an escape from scandal. Accusations persisted beyond the grave. The dead could not respond. The living decided what they had been. This awareness haunted medieval rulers. They lived not only for the present, but for posterity, a posterity they could not control. The weird life of medieval royalty was therefore lived in two dimensions: the immediate world of ritual and fear, and the imagined future of judgment and remembrance. They ruled under watchful eyes. They lived beneath listening ears. And they died knowing that their stories would be told by others, sometimes kindly, often not. In 1199, when King Richard V of England died from an infected wound received during a minor siege in Aquitaine, His death exposed not only the fragility of a warrior king, but the profound regional differences that shaped medieval royalty across Europe. Richard's reign, celebrated in legend and song, appeared radically different from that of his contemporaries in France or the Holy Roman Empire. Yet beneath surface contrasts of language, law, and custom lay a shared condition: the unnatural life of rulers forced to embody authority in worlds that demanded more than any single human could sustain. England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire produced different styles of monarchy, but the weirdness of royal life was universal. In England, kingship evolved within a framework of law earlier and more visibly than elsewhere. English kings ruled a relatively compact realm with defined borders, an increasingly literate bureaucracy, and powerful nobles who expected consultation. Charters, councils, and courts constrained royal action more tightly than on the continent. This constraint shaped royal behavior. English kings spent extraordinary amounts of time adjudicating disputes, issuing writs, and responding to petitions. Justice was personal and exhausting. A king's failure to hear cases could provoke unrest. A king who ruled too arbitrarily invited rebellion. The Magna Carta of 1215 formalized tensions that had existed for generations. It did not create limits on royal power so much as expose them. From that moment forward, English kings ruled under visible obligation, their authority constantly measured against custom and law. This produced anxiety. English royalty lived under scrutiny not only from nobles, but from an emerging legal culture that recorded, compared, and remembered. Mistakes were documented, promises were cited, failures accumulated on parchment. The English crown, therefore, fostered rulers who were often defensive, legalistic, and suspicious. Ritual remained important, but justification mattered more. France, by contrast, developed a more centralized and sacral vision of kingship. French kings were crowned at Rheims, anointed with holy oil believed to descend from heaven itself. This ritual reinforced the idea that French kingship was uniquely chosen by God. This sacral emphasis offered protection and risk. French kings enjoyed stronger symbolic authority, but when they failed, failure appeared cosmic. A military defeat was not merely strategic, it was theological. The king's body, marked by divine oil, carried heavier meaning. As a result, French royalty invested heavily in ritual, display, and religious patronage. Magnificence compensated for insecurity. Piety explained disaster. Yet French kings were also deeply entangled in noble networks. The kingdom was vast, communication slow, and enforcement uneven. Authority relied on cooperation as much as command. French royalty lived with the constant tension between sacred image and practical fragility. The Holy Roman Empire presented an entirely different problem. There, the emperor was not hereditary in the same sense. He was elected by princes who guarded their autonomy fiercely. His authority was universal in theory, ruler of Christendom, but limited in practice. This produced the strangest royal life of all. Emperors traveled endlessly, negotiating loyalty region by region. They ruled through charisma, marriage, patronage, and compromise. Their courts were itinerant and unstable. They lacked a permanent capital. An emperor's legitimacy depended on recognition rather than control. This created rulers who were perpetually insecure. They relied heavily on ritual, symbolism, and titles to project authority. Coronations occurred multiple times, as King of the Romans, King of Italy, Emperor, each conferring partial legitimacy. The emperor's life was a sequence of performances aimed at different audiences. Failure to appear in person meant loss of authority. Success depended on endurance. Despite these differences, common threads emerge. In all regions, royal life was shaped by surveillance. Kings and queens were watched relentlessly by nobles, clergy, towns, and rivals. Privacy did not exist. Even solitude was political. In all regions, royal bodies mattered excessively. Health, fertility, appearance, and behavior were read as signs of legitimacy or failure. In all regions, royal childhood was strategic, affection regulated, and education harsh. And in all regions, fear was constant. Fear of rebellion, fear of poisoning, fear of illness, fear of rumor, fear of divine judgment. Regional structures altered the expression of these fears, but not their presence. English kings feared law and memory. French kings feared cosmic meaning. Emperors feared irrelevance. Yet none escaped the underlying burden, to live as symbols in a world that increasingly demanded results. As the Middle Ages drew toward their close, these regional differences intensified rather than resolved. States became more complex. Expectations grew. Institutions expanded. Royalty did not become simpler. It became heavier. And the weirdness of medieval royal life reached its final form not in spectacle, but in exhaustion. Because by the 15th century, the crown no longer shielded rulers from scrutiny. It amplified it. What had once been mysterious became legible. What had once been sacred became debatable. What had once been endured became resented. Across Europe, kings and queens faced the same realization. The role they inhabited had outgrown the human capacity to sustain it. And this realization sets the stage for the final question. Not how medieval royalty lived, but why modern generations misunderstand that life so profoundly. In the modern imagination, medieval royalty often appears either enviable or monstrous. Kings are remembered as tyrants, conquerors, or fools. Queens appear as victims, schemers, or saints. Their lives are imagined as either glittering fantasies of privilege or dark chronicles of cruelty. What is rarely acknowledged is how structurally unnatural royal life actually was, and how deeply that unnaturalness shaped behavior, decision-making, and historical consequence. We misunderstand medieval royalty because we project modern assumptions onto a world that did not share them. We assume power brings freedom. In the medieval world, power brought exposure. We assume wealth brings security. In the medieval world, wealth was unstable, borrowed, symbolic, and often illusory. We assume authority brings control. In the medieval world, authority required constant performance, negotiation, and fear management. The medieval king was not a private individual who happened to rule. He was a public instrument through which society attempted to stabilize itself in the absence of modern institutions. The medieval queen was not an accessory to power, but a pressure valve, absorbing blame, performing legitimacy, and mediating conflict in systems that could not function without her labor. Royal weirdness was not eccentricity, it was adaptation. Modern observers often ask why medieval rulers were so paranoid, so violent, so obsessed with ritual and reputation. The answer lies not in personality, but in environment. These were lives lived without privacy, without safety, and without the option of withdrawal. Every weakness invited challenge. Every mistake echoed for generations. Every human impulse carried political risk. To rule was to exist inside permanent visibility. Modern leaders can resign. Medieval kings could not. Abdication was rare, dangerous, and often fatal. There was no retirement, no anonymity, no escape. A king ruled until death or deposition, and both outcomes were terrifying. Even childhood offered no refuge. Royal children learned early that affection was conditional, that love could be weaponized, and that survival depended on obedience and invisibility. These children grew into adults whose emotional lives had been shaped by fear long before they possessed authority. We also misunderstand medieval royalty because we confuse moral judgment with explanation. It is easy to condemn cruelty without understanding the incentives that produced it. Medieval justice was violent not because rulers were uniquely barbaric, but because violence was one of the few tools available to enforce order across fragmented territories. Mercy was praised, but only when it did not threaten control. Likewise, we often misinterpret religious devotion as superstition or hypocrisy. In reality, faith provided the only coherent framework capable of explaining catastrophe, suffering, and inequality. For royalty in particular, religion offered meaning where reason could not. It was not escape from reality. It was survival within it. Perhaps the greatest misunderstanding lies in how we imagine royal agency. We assume kings and queens chose their lives. Most did not. They inherited roles designed centuries earlier, embedded in rituals that could not be altered easily without destabilizing entire societies. Even reform-minded rulers found themselves constrained by expectation. Change risked rebellion. Tradition offered safety, even when it suffocated. This is why medieval royalty often appears frozen in contradiction, powerful yet constrained, revered yet feared, isolated yet surrounded. The crown magnified everything. It magnified fear. It magnified rumor. It magnified illness. It magnified love and resentment alike, and it magnified consequences. Small personal decisions, a marriage choice, a favorite elevated, a punishment imposed, could reshape decades of history. This disproportionate impact created caution, rigidity, and, at times, cruelty. The lives of medieval royalty remind us that power does not erase humanity. It distorts it. When we strip away myth and judgment, what remains is not a story of excess, but of endurance. Kings and queens endured pressures few modern individuals could tolerate: constant surveillance, ritualized existence, emotional deprivation, and the knowledge that failure would not merely harm them, but unravel the world around them. Their weirdness was the price of being asked to embody order itself. And when that order began to fracture, as institutions grew stronger, belief weakened, and societies changed, the medieval form of royalty could no longer function as it had. The crown survived. The role changed. But the bodies that once carried the weight of meaning alone were finally relieved of that impossible task. To understand medieval royalty, then, is not to admire or condemn them. It is to recognize the cost of building a society around a single human symbol, and to understand why such systems inevitably strain, distort, and eventually transform. The weird life of medieval royalty was not an anomaly in history. It was a warning, a reminder that no individual, no matter how anointed, crowned, or revered, can safely carry the full burden of collective order without being reshaped by it, often beyond recognition. And that is what their lives reveal most clearly: not how power elevates, but how it consumes.